Buenas tardes, a nombre del Tecnológico de Monterrey, Campus Guadalajara y de la Escuela de Ciencias Sociales y Gobierno, Región Occidente, les doy la bienvenida a esta plática sobre la evaluación estratégica ambiental y agradezco mucho la participación de Marcos Gutiérrez en esta plática, quien nos va a compartir su experiencia sobre el tema. Igualmente agradezco mucho a la profesora Luz Marcela Fernández, quien fue la coordinadora y organizadora de este evento. Para nosotros como Escuela de Ciencias Sociales y Gobierno es muy importante participar en estos proyectos y compartir este tipo de pláticas, ya que pueden servir para mejorar la legislación actual que tenemos, así como para compartir las buenas prácticas que pueden existir sobre el tema. Así es que, sin más preámbulos, le doy la palabra a la profesora Luz Marcela para que nos dé la introducción del tema. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctor Pedro. Pues bueno, vamos a como un preámbulo, un pequeño preámbulo de la charla que nos va a dar el maestro Marco Gutiérrez, platicarles pues de la importancia del tema que se esté abordando y sobre todo para los abogados, los futuros abogados que se están formando en el Tecnológico de Monterrey, en este tema tan trascendente de la evaluación ambiental estratégica, la cual es una herramienta para la toma de decisiones ambientales que se considera esencial para asegurar que el desarrollo de determinado contexto se planee y se implemente de tal forma que los efectos negativos sobre el medio ambiente sean minimizados. Se conoce como un proceso estructurado cuyo fin es integrar objetivos ambientales y de sustentabilidad a los niveles estratégicos de toma de decisiones tales como políticas, planes y programas públicos. La misma permite superar varias de las limitaciones de las evaluaciones de impacto ambiental a nivel proyecto, las que conocemos de manera tradicional en nuestro país, y esto permite asegurar que los impactos ambientales y las alternativas sean consideradas de manera más temprana en el proceso de la toma de decisiones. Cabe mencionar que diversos investigadores consideran que el uso de este tipo de herramienta en México permitiría abordar y mejorar el desempeño ambiental de instrumentos de política pública críticos para el país, como aquellos en materia de gestión de agua, energía y desarrollo urbano. Además, en México, históricamente hemos contado con problemáticas que desafortunadamente han desdeñado el componente del impacto ambiental en megaproyectos, máxime en aquellos que conllevan intereses ostensiblemente políticos y económicos. Muchos de los pasivos ambientales que este tipo de proyectos o megaproyectos nos han dejado pudieran haber sido evitados si se hubieran aplicado en nuestro país desde al menos una década este tipo de instrumento de la evaluación ambiental estratégica, sobre todo porque México pues sí cuenta con experiencia en el desarrollo de ordenamientos territoriales, que son otros de los instrumentos de política pública ambiental previstos en nuestra legislación. Y bueno, específicamente los ecológicos, que aunque en su mayoría no han sido armonizados o debidamente permeados para que se logren sus propósitos, sí se traducen en un área de oportunidad para contemplar en ellos los instrumentos de planeación que se encuentran dispersos respecto a temas, como ya lo mencionábamos, tanto urbanísticos, ambientales, sociales y económicos, que es precisamente uno de los propósitos de la evaluación ambiental estratégica y que urge regular, urge implementar en nuestro país, y para eso nuestros abogados futuros estarán trabajando en ello seguramente a partir de este interés que tiene el Tecnológico de Monterrey de que tengan la clase de Derecho Ambiental y Desarrollo Sustentable. Bueno, ahora les presento al maestro Marco Gutiérrez González, Marco Antonio, perdón, que les voy a platicar un poco de su gran trayectoria. Él es candidato a doctor por la Universidad RMIT o el Instituto Real de Tecnología de Melbourne, Australia, en donde colabora en el Centro de Investigación Urbana y en el Grupo Interdisciplinario de Investigación en Ciencias de la Conservación. Su proyecto de investigación aborda la evaluación ambiental estratégica como instrumento de soporte para la toma de decisiones ambientales. A través de dicho proyecto, investiga los resultados, oportunidades y riesgos de la evaluación ambiental estratégica desde una perspectiva de biodiversidad y servicios ecosistémicos. Marco también es maestro en medio ambiente y sustentabilidad urbana y regional por la Universidad de Melbourne e ingeniero ambiental por la Universidad del ITESO. De 2015 a 2018 se desempeñó como director de evaluación del impacto ambiental en la Secretaría de Medio Ambiente y Desarrollo Territorial del Estado de Jalisco, en donde tuvimos la oportunidad de coincidir y por eso nos conocemos, somos amigos desde entonces, grandes amigos. Y pues también antes de ello fue consultor ambiental en materia de evaluación del impacto ambiental. Y bueno, sin mayor preámbulo, muchas gracias Marco por compartirnos este tema y estamos atentos. Ah, perdón.
Thank you very much.
Perdón, algo que me faltó señalar es si por favor nuestros asistentes nos pueden apoyar a ponernos en el chat de qué universidad nos acompañan o de qué empresa nos están acompañando, también su formación, si gustan, para que podamos nosotros enriquecer lo más posible esta plática. Perdón, Marco, bienvenido.
Thank you very much, Marcela and Pedro, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here today to present about this topic. My name is Marco. I'm a third year now, PhD student at RMIT University. I'm part of the ICON Science Research Lab, which is a research group where we investigate about biodiversity conservation from a bunch of different angles. My PhD focuses on this very topic of strategic environmental assessment. And I guess my take on this topic is to better understand the effectiveness of this approach in relation to biodiversity conservation. I'm interested in investigating the outcomes, the risks, and the opportunities of strategic environmental assessment from a biodiversity conservation perspective. So to me, this is a very interesting topic, and I hope that in the next 30 minutes or so, I will be able to share some of the things that I've learned so far from this topic. So in this presentation, I will cover the following things. First, I will talk about what strategic environmental assessment, or SEA for short, is and its main benefits or strengths. Then I'll go over some of the key differences between SEA and environmental impact assessment, or EIA. After that, I will talk about some of the applications, and I'll mention 2 examples of cases where it has been used. Then I'll explain a bit about the process for conducting an SEA, and also about the implementation of SEA and the different activities that can be used to keep track of its progress. And I'll also mention some of the main limitations and challenges. And lastly, I will talk about SEA here in Australia and about a case study that I'm investigating as part of my PhD. So first, what is strategic environmental assessment? So there's a bunch of definitions out there. If you Google strategic environmental assessment, you'll find a bunch of definitions. But I think one that I like, because it reflects well its purpose, is this one. And that defines it as a structured process aiming to integrate environmental and sustainability objectives in strategic or higher levels of decision making, such as policies, plans, and programs. So a key thing about SEA is that it is used to support decision making at those higher or strategic levels instead of the project level. It is mainly used to to support the development of policies, plans, and programs, which can be things like land use plans, urban development plans, water management policies, agriculture policies, and so on. We'll see some specific examples in a little bit. Another thing to point out is that many policies, plans, and programs have a large spatial influence. And so a landscape scale is commonly used when conducting an SEA for those policies, plans, and programs. So an advantage of having such a wide spatial scope, and another key feature of SEA, is that it can facilitate the analysis of cumulative impacts. And cumulative impacts are those impacts that are caused by several projects or activities. And these cumulative impacts normally would go unaccounted for in environmental impact assessments at the project level. So SEA tries to make sense of those impacts and to analyze them. And also SEA can allow for impacts to be mitigated in a more strategic way. When we get to the case study that I mentioned at the beginning, we'll see an example of this in practice, which will hopefully make it a bit more clear. So now let's clarify a little bit more how SEA is different to EIA, or environmental impact assessment. So as I mentioned before, SEA is used to support the development of policies, plans, and programs, and to integrate environmental considerations at that level, whereas EIA is applied more at the lower level, at the project level in the diagram. And I like this diagram because I think it's also useful to illustrate how policies, plans, and programs and projects work in relation to one another. So we can think of a policy as an instrument that sits at the top of the decision-making hierarchy. And that consists of a bunch of plans that are going to help accomplish and deliver that policy. Then we have plans which are achieved by implementing programs, and the similar situation, a bunch of programs help deliver a plan. And at the lower level, we are having now programs which are made up of different projects. And the last level that we have is projects that are more, much more tangible actions, such as developments or activities. And EIA is used at that last level to understand the implications of the projects on the environment, and SEA is used at the higher levels to understand the implications that those instruments could have on the environment and design them in a way that is more sustainable. So here we can see some of the main differences side by side. So the first one is the one that we saw on the previous slide. EIA is applied at the project level and SEA at the policy, plan, and program level. Another difference is that EIA is used to understand the potential impacts of defined proposals, whereas SEA is used to analyze strategic goals and objectives. So also EIA is usually associated to an approval process, whereas SEA is more commonly associated to a planning process. We'll see that a bit more later on. And this can also depend on the decision-making context. So for example, here in Australia, SEA is legislated in a way that also associates it to a approval process. And again, we'll see this with a bit more detail later on. Also, EIA uses a relatively standard methodology, whereas more flexible methodologies can be used for SEA. And this will depend on the case that it's being used for. And lastly, a well-conducted EIA will analyze project alternatives, whereas a well-conducted SEA is going to be analyzing strategic options. So that's another key thing. So now let's talk about some of the applications for SEA, and I will show you 2 examples. So first of all, SEA is a very flexible approach in that it can be applied either at the national level, at a regional level, or at a more local level. It can be used for to analyze policies, plans, and programs from different sectors. So sectors like the urban planning sector or the mining sector, transport or forestry, fisheries, water, energy, tourism. And this is just to mention a few because yeah, the applications are very wide. And it can also be applied to analyze specific issues like climate change or biodiversity loss. So the first example that I want to show you is the SEA of Rio Tinto iron ore expansion for the Pilbara. And Rio Tinto is the name of one of the biggest mining companies in the world. This SEA had the objective of assessing the environmental impacts of a plan to expand the iron ore mining activities of Rio Tinto and developing mining infrastructure in the Pilbara region in Western Australia. So iron ore is a raw material that is used to make iron and which is then used to make steel for buildings, cars, ships, furniture, and it has many other uses. So here we can see a map of the study area for this SEA, which is highlighted in yellow. And as you can see, it is pretty big. It's a pretty big region in the west of Australia. Here below, you can see the map of Australia, and in red is this excerpt or this extract map that we're seeing. So the region is pretty big. The company already has a few mines in operation there, and they're planning to open up new ones. So this series of mine projects, which are massive by themselves, were contained in this one bigger mining development plan that was subject to the SEA. So as you can imagine, analyzing all these mines scattered across the landscape using a case-by-case environmental impact assessment approach might be limited when analyzing the impacts to the ecosystems of this region. Things like species and habitats and their distributions, for example. If every single mine was to have an environmental impact assessment, that would be okay, but it wouldn't go that far as to understand what the impacts of all of those are on the whole region. So this is where the cumulative feature of strategic environmental assessment comes into effect. So analyzing all the cumulative impacts of these projects can be done when using an SEA approach. And another advantage is that if we are trying to understand the impacts of all these different mining projects in the region, then we can also design measures to mitigate those impacts in a more strategic way, either by concentrating restoration efforts in a certain area of the landscape, or by using offsetting in another part of the landscape, but concentrating those mitigation efforts into an area, or to do them in a way that is more strategic makes more sense when we're talking about a region. So the second case that I wanted to show you is another one that it's a bit different, and that's just to show the very different applications that SEA can have. So this was the SEA conducted for the port of Cape Town in South Africa. And this SEA was conducted in 2004. And it had the objective of developing a framework or a plan to facilitate long-term sustainable port development and operation in Cape Town. So that's the port of Cape Town, and towards the back you can see part of the city of Cape Town. So in this case, rather than to analyze a plan that was already sort of defined, like we saw in the Rio Tinto example, the SEA process here was used in a more proactive way. And it was used to develop a sustainability framework for the development and the operation of the port that integrates biophysical, social, and economic aspects as part of the port planning process. So during the SEA process, they define some strategic issues that will need to be addressed in the coming years to achieve this sustainable development of the port. And these things include things like maintaining marine ecosystem functions and habitats, maintaining the stability of the shoreline, addressing planning issues in this sort of transition area between the port and the city, addressing the socioeconomic impact of port development and operations, etc. So as you can see, the SEA here was used a bit different because instead of analyzing the impacts of a sort of predefined plan, like it was in the Rio Tinto case, it helped develop a sustainability plan and to identify these issues that are going to be expected in the coming years, so that they can be assessed or addressed in a strategic and proactive way, and maybe even before they begin to occur. So now let's talk a bit about the process for conducting an SEA. So I'm going to show you the Australian example because that's where I'm right now, and that's the one that I've been studying. But just keep in mind that the way SEA is applied in other countries varies from place to place. So this can look a bit different in different parts of the world. But here in Australia, SEA is conducted under the EPBC Act, and that stands for Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. So it's the federal level legislation instrument that looks after the environment and its protection. So the analogous would be the LEGEPA in Mexico. So first, the first part of the process, and this might be a little bit similar to environmental impact assessment. There is a scoping stage where the key issues that the assessment is going to be focusing on are determined, as well as the desired outcomes and possible constraints that might happen in the assessment. And this is done by two parties. So one is the Federal Department of Environment, and the second party is the proponent of the policy plan and program, or the assessment partner, and which can be, in most cases, another government organization like a state or a local government department, or in fewer cases, a private company like the case of Rio Tinto. So those two parties, the next step is that they sign a formal agreement to undertake the assessment, and they come up with terms of reference, and they come up with this document, which sets the objectives and the requirements for the assessment in the assessment report. And a draft of these terms of reference can be released for public comment, and that is done frequently with the objective of incorporating any other issues that members of the public might think are missing. And so, yeah, if they are released for public comment and people think that another thing should be included, then that comes back to the assessment partners, and they develop the final terms of reference. And then the proponent undertakes the assessment according to that document, or the requirements of that document. So the next step is that a draft program report is developed, and this contains a description of the proposed activities and the commitment to protect the environment. And then a second report that is released at this stage is the draft strategic assessment report, which details all the impacts that the implementation of the proposed policy plan or program is going to have on the environment. So these are sort of like the main the main reports of the strategic assessment at this stage. They are draft reports. So what happens next is that they are released for public comment for a minimum period of 28 days. They are available to the public, and this can be longer if necessary, if the policy planning program being assessed is very complex and documents are very long, then the period might be longer. So those documents are, so the public then comments on those documents, and after they comment, all the commentary comes back to the assessment partners, and they have to consider those comments and revise the documents. That means like making another version of the document that integrates those comments. And another thing that can happen here is that the Minister of Environment might recommend some changes to the policy planner program, and therefore those need to be integrated in this stage as well. The next statutory step is the endorsement of the program, and that is when the Minister of Environment, says, okay, this complies with the terms of references, and this policy plan and program is now endorsed. That means that it is now one step closer to the approval of all the different actions that will come out of that program. So yeah, the next stage is the approval of those actions. So once it is endorsed, the next stage is to approve all the different projects or actions or activities that come out of those endorsed policies, plans, and programs. And the last stage is the implementation of the policy plan and program, and that is usually an ongoing stage depending on the length of the policy planning program, and it involves things like monitoring and the environmental impacts that are happening, and auditing those to make sure that they're not, going over limits. And also it includes some elements of reporting the outcomes in a regular basis. Might be like once a year or once every 5 years. It depends really on the policy planner program. So as you can see, the SEA process might resemble or be similar in a way of what you might already learned in relation to environmental impact assessment. But I guess one key difference to point out is that in many SEAs, the proponent or the entity who is developing the proposal is in many cases another government organization, like a state or a local government department. And I guess that's a bit different in a way to EIA, in that the proponents of the EIA are commonly private organizations. They can be also government departments, but for the most part, when we are talking about EIA processes and specific projects, the great majority of them are related to private enterprises. So now I'll talk a bit about the strategic assessment, environmental assessment stage of implementation and follow-up. So implementation is that stage or phase that follows the endorsement and the approval stages. And that's where the actions and the commitments and the recommendations that resulted from the assessment, such as the mitigation or the offset measures, are executed. So with follow-up, we're talking about those activities that are needed in the implementation stage for it to be effective. And we can identify 4 types of follow-up activities or components. The first one is monitoring, which are those activities that are done to collect data about the environmental components that were determined to be important in the assessment. And monitoring involves measuring how those components are actually doing as compared to what was expected when the assessment was being conducted. The second element is evaluation, and that involves making sense of the monitoring data and linking that data to management decisions. So there may be some factors, for example, that were not anticipated in the assessment, or maybe the implementation is not going, as fast as it was expected to go, and there are some mistakes and errors there. So evaluation activities helps us identify those differences between what was expected and what is actually happening. The third component is management, and the idea here is to make decisions and take action to address the issues that were identified as a result of monitoring and evaluation. So here we're talking about finding ways to respond to unexpected impacts and protect the environment, for example. The last component is communication and reporting, and the objective here is to inform all the stakeholders and the general public about the actual impacts that are occurring and the conformance of those impacts of the implementation plan to those people who are affected by or who have responsibility to oversee the implementation. So, coming up with reports to say to the regulator authority, which in the case of Australia is the federal authority, to tell them, okay, we are undertaking these measures, everything is going according to plan or not, and this is what we're doing to correct the things that are going wrong. So those are all the reports that come out at the implementation stage. So now I'll talk about the limitations and the main challenges of strategic environmental assessment. And I'll go over these 5 limitations and challenges that I've seen or read in a few reports that and articles that mentioned, some of the weaknesses of strategic environmental assessment. So one thing that is commonly mentioned is that the process for conducting a strategic environmental assessment is usually not very clear. And this may be because SEA tends to be more flexible by nature, depending on where it's applied and for what purpose. It might not always follow the same process, and therefore this results in a perceived lack of clarity on people trying to figure out what is the right process. Well, sometimes there is no one process because it's very flexible. Another issue related to that is that people might perceive it as being vague and confusing. And I think this has to do with people trying to view it similar to environmental impact assessment. But in many ways, as we saw before, it is not. So that might be the reason why it's perceived as being vague and confusing. So yeah, it's important to keep in mind what the differences between SEA and EIA are. So there are also issues with the integration of public participation. As we saw earlier, SEA has a bigger spatial scope and can encompass multiple projects and objectives. And therefore, that means that there can be a lot of different stakeholders involved in the process, whose ideas and opinions might be incompatible or very hard to integrate. So as opposed to environmental impact assessment, where we have one defined activity that is going to happen at one precise location, in those processes, it can still be very difficult to integrate public participation. But if we compare it to SEA is way more complicated in that aspect. So another thing is the analysis of cumulative impacts can be very complicated, also because of the large scale of strategic environmental assessment. And there can be many projects and many activities causing direct and indirect impacts in the environment. So it can get very difficult to integrate and analyze all of those impacts. And also because the time frame of the policy planning program is usually bigger as compared to a project. You know, we're talking about a policy and a planner program that is going to take at the least, you know, 2 years to implement, but we have others that take, you know, 6 years or 10 years. So the implementation stage of the SEA is usually very long as well, and can take, you know, years or if not decades to complete. And in this time frame, a lot of things can change. You know, the environmental conditions can change. The institutions can change. People within organizations also change. And so many times the outcomes that are actually achieved might not be the same that were expected initially. So that's one of the weaknesses, I guess, of strategic environmental assessment. So now I'll talk about how it works here in Australia, strategic environmental assessment. So here in Australia, SEAs are better known as strategic assessments. So they dropped the environmental, but they're still the same thing. And as I mentioned before, they are legislated under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the EPBC Act. And under this legislation, the policies, plans, and programs that are potentially subject to a strategic assessment are regional scales, urban development plans and policies, large scale industrial development and associated infrastructure, fire, vegetation, resource, or pest management policies, plans and programs, water extraction or water use policies, and infrastructure plans and policies. So they have these very defined 5 things in which they want to focus the strategic environmental assessments on, and that's defined in that legislation. And also within that legal framework, an SEA may be conducted when one of these policies, plans, and programs is likely to cause impacts on matters of national environmental significance. And those are also very defined specific things, such as listed threatened species and ecological communities. Also, if one of these policies, plans, and programs is going to impact on migratory species, then also an SEA might be needed. And other specific matters that are defined in that legislation cause or trigger the use of the strategic environmental assessment tool. So since I think 2008, so a bit over more than 10 years ago, when they started to be using here in Australia, there have been 26 SEAs conducted under the EPBC Act. As you can see, half of them have been conducted or are being conducted still for urban development plans, and then a little bit over a quarter are focused on industrial developments, and the rest of them on the other 3 types of policies, plans, and programs. So in terms of the status, of those 26, only 12 have reached the stage of endorsement. Some of them are still in progress. That's the blue piece of the pie here. One has been canceled, so they no longer wanted to pursue that policy planning program, so they took it off, and the process was canceled. And 8 are at a stage that I named here uncertain, and that means that they started more than 3 years ago. So the process for the assessment started more than 3 years ago, but a decision to endorse it or to reject it has not been made since then. So they are sort of like in a limbo state, and this can be for many reasons, including public opposition to the policy planning program, political conflicts, or maybe there was like a change in government, and therefore the new government no longer wants to pursue that policy planning program. Or there can be like economic reasons, maybe that policy planning program, if we're talking, for example, about urban development, maybe the housing market is not as good as it was when the assessment was commenced. So therefore, it doesn't make any sense at the moment to continue doing the assessment. So it really depends on each one of those 8 cases, but this is just to give you an idea of where they stand in terms of their status. And the case study that I wanted to mention is, and the one that I'm looking into in my PhD, is the Melbourne Strategic Assessment. So the Melbourne Strategic Assessment is one of the first strategic assessments that were conducted here in Australia. And this assessment was conducted between March 2009 and February 2010. So a little bit over 1 year, this was at the assessment stage. And this had the objective of analyzing the potential implications of a program called Delivering Melbourne's New Sustainable Communities, by which Melbourne, its growth boundary would be expanded for urban development to accommodate an expected growth in urban population over the next decades. So this map shows what the urban growth boundary was before the expansion, and that's all the areas in gray and sort of like the black borderline here. And under the program that was assessed, the program had the objective of expanding that border and to include these areas in yellow and in pink. So the assessment focused on, assessing what and identifying and quantifying the potential impacts of expanding the city to these areas on things like biodiversity. So those matters of national environmental significance that I mentioned earlier. So these were the matters that were analyzed in the assessment. These are threatened ecological communities or ecosystems that only exist here in Australia, and that are in a threatened status because they had been lost in the past, and only a few of them remain. So their protection status is very, very high. So we're talking about grasslands, and then grasslands that contain woody elements, so trees, and grasslands that are located in close to wetlands as well. Another matter of national environmental significance that was assessed here were threatened flora species. So these were the 2 species that were present in those areas that needed protection, that are protected, but that needed to be assessed in the assessment. And also fauna species. So we have a golden sun moth, striped legless lizard. This looks like a snake, but it's really a lizard without legs. And this looks like a rat, but it's a bandicoot. It's another marsupial and a threatened species here in Australia. And the growling grass frog was another one. So as part of the strategic environmental assessment process, besides analyzing the potential impacts on those things that we saw previously, some measures to mitigate those impacts were proposed. And one of the main proposed measures was to establish a big reserve to offset the impacts on those grassland communities and some of the species that we just saw. And this is known, or will be known, as the Western Grasslands Reserves, which we can see here in this map in green. So all the area in green, these 2 separate polygons in total are 15,000 hectares in size, and it's located to the west of Melbourne. So just to give you an idea, compared to Guadalajara, the Primavera forest is 30,000 hectares, and this is half the size of it. This is 15,000 hectares. of grasslands. And in terms of the progress in delivering this offset site and in implementing it, the progress has been very, very slow. So if we were talking about this assessment finalizing in 2010 and we're now in 2020, so 10 years of implementation of this assessment have resulted in the acquisition. So these are all private properties for the most part. So what the government has to do is to acquire, to purchase the properties to establish this reserve. And only the areas in bolder green, in darker green, are the ones that have been purchased by the government. And the areas in light green are still private properties. And therefore that means that they're subject to a number of threats. So there are grasslands in these areas, but they are not being managed. And so there's a lot of infestation from weeds and just mismanagement of those areas. So the values that people are trying to conserve and to protect in these areas are being degraded because the progress in the implementation is being really, really slow. So to investigate this case study, I'm interviewing a bunch of different people from different perspectives to see how the implementation is going. And this is a key thing in SEA research, because not a lot of implementation studies have been conducted. If you search in the literature, there's not a lot that tells you what goes on actually when SEA reaches the stage of implementation. So yeah, this is what I was talking before. When the assessment was conducted in 2010, the Commonwealth government or the federal government decided to endorse the program. And this meant giving its consent for development to go ahead in those new areas, provided that the commitments are delivered. And since then, the state government, who is the proponent in this case of this plan, has been working on implementing and delivering the main offset site, the Western Grasslands Reserve that we saw on the previous slide, and other biodiversity commitments. So there have been quite a few difficulties or challenges with the implementation process. So yeah, I'm investigating those challenges by interviewing some of the people who were involved in the assessment or who have been involved or affected by its implementation. So some of the issues that I've heard so far are, for example, that the commitments are not being met on time. So this thing that only about 10% of the properties have been purchased by the government and the rest are still in private hands. And the grassland communities and the species are more vulnerable to degradation occurring from weed infestation and other threats. And I think this has to do, or people have told me that this has to do with the financial arrangements that were set up for this case. So because most of the offset property is privately owned, the government needs to purchase the land from private landholders, and that requires money. So the money to do that is supposed to come from the taxes that are being charged to the developers who are going to be building in those new growth areas. So because the housing market is not doing as well as it was expected 10 years ago, there's not a lot of development going on in those areas. And so there's not a lot of money coming into the government to be able to purchase the land. I don't know if that makes sense. But another issue is that because the parties of the assessment were two government organizations, so we have the Victorian government in one part and the federal government on the second part. There's not a lot of, it's a bit different if we think about if the proponent was a private entity, the government would definitely have more tools to enforce the private entity to deliver the results. But because we're talking about two government entities, there's a lot of things they can do to, you know, renegotiate the time frame and be lenient and, you know, be a bit compassionate about the Victorian government for the lack of, you know, compliance. And there's not, let's just say that there's not a lot of tools that the federal government can use to enforce the Victorian government to deliver these commitments to biodiversity conservation. So people also think that the communication component of follow-up that I mentioned earlier has not been very effective. So stakeholders or the public are not informed in a timely manner what is going on with the implementation process, and they're not given, they feel that they're not given the chance to voice their opinions in a way that could be taken into consideration by the authorities. So it's very uncertain what will happen in this case. Some people think that the commitments will never be delivered. Other people think that it will take a very, very long time. And, you know, more recently, the state government is coming up with new measures to increase the revenue that they get from development in an attempt to sort of amend this mistake. So I guess, you know, we'll see what happens in the next years, whether that strategy is effective or not. It's yet to be seen. But yeah, this is a very interesting example or case study that I'm seeing here in my PhD. And I guess that's just another way to show you just that strategic environmental assessment might have a lot of benefits, but we also need to think about the challenges that this instrument brings when we are trying to legislate for it. So it's not just a matter of, okay, let's do this, let's legislate for it without actually knowing what's going to happen. So I think for Mexico, one of the main conclusions that I can make is that, yeah, before trying to legislate, it's good to come up with draft legislation and to consider that. But I think even before that, we need to do a lot of piloting and to do strategic environmental assessment, even when it's not legally required. So that takes a lot of effort, promotion or intention from behalf of the government of wanting to undertake the assessments without it being legally required. But I think it's absolutely essential that they do this to understand how this might work in Mexico and what are the things that might work in that country, given, you know, our geographical context, our legislation, our institutional frameworks, to sort of like fine tune those key things that need to be thought through before actually implementing it. So conducting a lot of pilots and smaller case studies might be the way to go before actually legislating. But sure, I mean, it's also good to be thinking about what needs to happen in terms of legislation and where can this instrument fit, and what can be the most effective way to deliver it in terms of the legislation. So that's all that I have in terms of the material. Thank you for listening, and I hope that this was interesting for you. And I'm very happy to take any questions that the public might have. I might switch to speaking in Spanish now with the questions, or if you ask them in English, I'm also happy to answer them that way. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Marco, por tan interesante, por tan interesante explicación que nos das de este muy importante instrumento de política pública y cómo han estado pues implementándolo en Australia. Y bueno, sí tenemos aquí algunas preguntas de nuestros espectadores. Y bueno, tenemos por parte de Sara Gómez del TEC de Monterrey, de aquí de Campus Guadalajara. Nos comenta, o más bien nos pregunta si se podría decir que la evaluación del impacto ambiental estratégico te dice cuáles son los daños que se pueden provocar con respecto a cierta construcción, mientras que la evaluación de impacto ambiental, la que entendemos aquí como tradicional en México, te propone las formas de mitigar este daño.
Yo creo que lo que puedo contestar ahí es que la evaluación de impacto ambiental te sirve para las dos cosas. O sea, si estás hablando de una actividad o de un proyecto, te sirve tanto como para conocer cuáles van a ser los impactos de esa actividad o de ese proyecto y las medidas para mitigarlo. La diferencia con la evaluación ambiental estratégica es la que platicaba al principio de la presentación, que en lugar de aplicarla a un proyecto en específico, lo estamos aplicando a políticas, planes y programas. Entonces, a lo mejor en ese momento todavía no vamos a tener un plan, una política, perdón, un proyecto definido, sino que más bien vamos a tener opciones estratégicas de desarrollo. Entonces, esa sería como la diferencia.
Muchas gracias. También por otro lado, pues sería la pregunta de ¿cuáles crees que sean los principales obstáculos que han impedido que se adopte jurídicamente en México la evaluación de impacto ambiental estratégica?
Obstáculos. Yo creo que, o sea, todo comienza, siento que con el interés político y institucional de llevar a cabo esta implementación. Entonces, quizás eso es en lo que hemos estado careciendo, que no existe la suficiente motivación política o institucional para implementarlo. Y hay muchas, yo creo que causas de por qué no hay el suficiente interés. A lo mejor una de ellas puede ser que pues no estamos acostumbrados a esta herramienta, todavía no estamos tan informados de cómo funciona, de cómo se puede aplicar. Entonces, por lo tanto, si se trata de algo completamente nuevo, pues obviamente hay cierta como resistencia a implementar algo que no sabemos cómo se va a desenvolver. Entonces, yo creo que para superar esa barrera, pues sí, o sea, hace falta bastante difusión y aprendizaje de cómo esta herramienta pudiera servir en el contexto mexicano.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, comentarte, haciendo un paréntesis, que nos acompañan espectadores del TEC de Monterrey, de Campus Guadalajara y del CUTONALA de la Universidad de Guadalajara están aquí también presentes. Y de hecho, precisamente, Oscar Gómez comenta que es muy entendible lo que nos estás explicando. Muchas gracias. Y bueno, pasamos a la siguiente pregunta. ¿En qué tipo de actividades que comúnmente se desarrollan en México o estas obras que son como más comunes de nuestro país, crees que o consideras que pueda ser útil el aplicar, como nos mencionabas incluso de una manera piloto, la evaluación de impacto ambiental estratégico?
Yo creo que definitivamente uno de los que se me viene a la mente ahorita es el tema de la planeación urbana. O sea, todos los instrumentos de planeación urbana que tenemos, llámense programas municipales de desarrollo urbano, planes parciales de desarrollo urbano, inclusive hasta hay programas estatales de desarrollo urbano. Entonces, en esas herramientas de planeación urbana que inciden sobre pues, territorios amplios, yo creo que sería muy valioso el utilizar la evaluación ambiental estratégica también en los programas de ordenamiento ecológico territorial. Eso hablando del ámbito territorial, pero también pueden utilizarse, por ejemplo, para la planeación de actividades en el sector energético, en el sector de agua. Creo que también hay mucha posibilidad de aplicación ok, tenemos programas sectoriales en esos ámbitos, entonces una de las aplicaciones puede ser analizar el impacto ambiental de manera estratégica de cuáles van a ser los efectos de implementar esos planes sectoriales.
Excelente, muchas gracias. Y bueno, justamente lo que nos mencionas está relacionado con la siguiente pregunta. en cuanto a los ordenamientos ecológico-territoriales. ¿Consideras que deberían ser sujetos a una evaluación ambiental estratégica previo a su autorización? ¿Y también los planes de desarrollo urbano?
Sí, yo creo que es esencial que se realice previo a la autorización, o sea, es la etapa como adecuada, ¿no? Antes de siquiera aprobarlos, que podamos entender de una manera más detallada, pues, cuáles van a ser los posibles impactos ambientales de esos instrumentos en los componentes. No tenemos que analizar, también otra cosa que no sé si quedó clara con la presentación, es que no tenemos que analizar todos los componentes ambientales que se encuentren dentro del ámbito de aplicación de una política, plan y programa. Simplemente nos tenemos que enfocar en aquellos que son más relevantes. Entonces, los esfuerzos de hacer una evaluación ambiental estratégica no tienen que ser titánicos, tienen que, si están bien enfocados sobre los componentes críticos y los componentes más relevantes, pues como vimos en el caso de Melbourne, no se tiene que llevar bastante tiempo para hacerlo. En cuestión de meses o de menos de un año lo podemos llevar a cabo si es de esa forma como más aterrizada. Y definitivamente sí, pues antes de que sean aprobados. También otra cosa es que a lo mejor no necesitamos hacerlo para todos los planes parciales, para todos los planes de ordenamiento ecológico territorial. O sea, de manera inicial, yo creo que podría empezarse con aquellos que son más críticos, en donde tenemos condiciones ambientales más frágiles, donde los impactos ambientales pueden ser más significativos. Y ya gradualmente a lo mejor seguirlo implementando en más instrumentos.
Perfecto, muchas gracias. Nos quedan un par de preguntas más. Y bueno, esta es relativa a qué le recomendarías a los futuros abogados y también a los futuros profesionales en las diversas ramas técnicas que pues confluyen en materia ambiental y específicamente en este instrumento tan importante y que la verdad sí consideramos que urge que lo apliquemos aquí en México para que se promueva o promuevan justamente la aplicación del mismo, ¿no? En nuestro país o en nuestro estado.
Pues yo creo que lo primero es como estudiar casos o sea, más bien entender cómo se realiza en otros lugares primero, ¿no? O sea, ver ejemplos, entender bien cómo es el proceso, entender bien cuáles han sido como las limitaciones en esos lugares, o sea, además de las ventajas que son evidentes, también como vemos hay limitaciones, entonces yo creo que lo primero, pues sí, es entrar de lleno como a entender cómo ha sido. Y ya después de eso, sí podría sugerir que se comience a pensar cómo adaptar esas experiencias de otros lugares a nuestro contexto mexicano. Ya sería como el paso 2, digamos. Y el tercer paso, pues es empezar a promover el instrumento en aquellas personas que se pueden considerar como pues tomadores de decisión y que en su momento estarían en sus manos el implementar estas herramientas, o sea, llámese personal de gubernamental en distintas dependencias o legisladores o legisladoras, todas esas personas al final pues son quienes tenemos o son a quienes tenemos que contactar para que finalmente se pueda implementar en el marco jurídico y en el marco práctico también la evaluación ambiental estratégica.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, tenemos aquí una pregunta relacionada justamente con lo que nos estás platicando y es respecto de si el interés de las instituciones y de la política dependerían de un aspecto estratégico político o es darle el valor o la importancia a la problemática que se busca abordar con este instrumento.
Ya, sí, yo creo que el interés, pues también puede venir de la parte de abordar una problemática en específico. O sea, y yo sí he visto un interés pues de ciertos actores de querer utilizar este instrumento. O sea, el hecho de que no lo tengamos completamente implementado no significa que no haya ya algunos pilotajes hechos en México. O sea, sí se ha intentado trabajar con esta herramienta. En la administración en la que estuvimos, Marcela y yo, intentamos hacer una evaluación ambiental estratégica para el área del Bajío, de Guadalajara. La administración actual está piloteando una evaluación ambiental estratégica de Puerto Vallarta. Y en otras partes del país, en años anteriores, se ha trabajado la evaluación ambiental estratégica para diferentes usos. Sí han sido muy limitados los casos, pero yo creo que sí nace el interés a veces como de una problemática en particular, y también del interés por parte de la autoridad de querer abordar esa problemática a través de la evaluación ambiental estratégica.
Muchas
No
gracias.
sé si
Pues mira,
responde a la
perdón,
pregunta.
sí. Y bueno, pues te decía que teníamos 2 preguntas más, pero están llegándonos unas cuantas más.
Perfecto.
Aquí Jorge Miguel Álvarez nos pregunta, ¿qué pasa con los países de tercer mundo que tienen un mayor interés en el desarrollo económico? ¿Debería permitírseles tener una legislación ambiental más permisiva?
Ok. Yo creo que la legislación ambiental está ahí por razones, ¿no? O sea, tenemos componentes ambientales que requieren de protección, porque ya sea porque están en riesgo o están limitados, o están degradados por la misma actividad humana. Entonces la protección ambiental, desde mi punto de vista, siempre pues tiene su rol, ¿no? Juega su rol en esa parte de controlar el impacto ambiental pues sí, en el medio ambiente. Entonces, pues sí, pensar en legislación más permisiva en países en desarrollo, a mí la verdad no estoy tan de acuerdo como con esa idea. Más bien lo que deberíamos buscar es, pues sí, también considerar que la actividad económica puede llevarse a cabo de manera compatible con el medio ambiente. Entonces buscar la forma de cómo poder apegarnos a lo que ya existe en cuestión de legislación. Y es más, o sea, también fortalecer la misma legislación que ya tenemos y ampliarla, porque estamos viviendo en una época de degradación ambiental muy fuerte. Entonces, sí no podemos, por decirlo, quitar el pie del pedal, ¿cómo se dice?
El pie del cañón.
Quitar el cañón o quitar el dedo del renglón. Tenemos que más bien fortalecer esos instrumentos legales que ya tenemos.
De acuerdo. Aquí nos preguntan Leonardo Fuentes y Yareli Zaragoza nos hacen la misma pregunta respecto de cuáles consideras que serían los mecanismos de difusión para romper con esta resistencia entre el interés político por la legislación medioambientalista.
Perdón, ¿cuál era la primera parte de la pregunta? Se acordó un poquito.
Perdón. ¿Cuáles serían los mecanismos de difusión para romper con la resistencia entre el interés político por la legislación medioambientalista?
Ya. Medios de difusión. Yo creo que hay muchas estrategias para llegarle a las personas que nos representan, ya sea en el ejecutivo o en el legislativo. O sea, desde mi punto de vista, el contacto con esas personas es súper clave para hacer llegar cualquier tipo de información, ¿no? Entonces, digo, aquí lo que está funcionando mucho en Australia son las peticiones, también las cartas dirigidas precisamente a esos legisladores son pues bastante como recibidas y o sea, sí les ponen atención a ese tipo de comunicaciones. A lo mejor no es el mismo caso que en México, pero yo creo que el que grupos de la sociedad civil se organicen y exijan algún tipo de cambio, eh, claro, o sea, la verdad es que no soy experto en estrategias de comunicación para llegar a ese público, pues, pero siento que esa es una de las estrategias más efectivas para poder hacerlo. Y encontrar ajá, es la parte más difícil, ¿no? Pero encontrar a esas personas clave que son asesores de política al gobierno. O sea, que muchas veces no se encuentran trabajando dentro del gobierno, sino que más bien asesoran a quienes están colaborando en esos puestos. Entonces, esas son las personas también claves que hay que ir investigando quiénes son y tratar de convencer de que se hagan las cosas de un modo distinto.
Muchas gracias, Marco. En este sentido, si me permites, quisiera apoyar un poco en responder a nuestros espectadores. Actualmente está en el Senado de la República el Tratado de Escazú, que es el que pues, nos va a permitir tener una mayor apertura en cuanto a acceso a la información y participación en cuestiones de medio ambiente. El que esté ya en el Senado de la República significa que ya estaría pues terminándose de cocinar para que sea ratificado y ya forme parte obligatoria México del mismo. Y por otro lado, con esta firma que se hizo del nuevo Tratado de Libre Comercio con América del Norte, bueno, en estos 3 países de América del Norte y que entra en vigor el 1 de julio, hay un artículo, el 24, perdón, un capítulo que es el 24, que es específicamente en materia ambiental y tiene su acuerdo renovado de cooperación ambiental, en donde se hace mucho énfasis en este tema, en este punto que nos manifestabas, Marco, de el dar a conocer esta información, tener informada a toda la, pues los habitantes de estos 3 países, e inclusive se da continuidad a este mecanismo de presentar denuncias o presentar peticiones de revisión a las autoridades ambientales de cualquiera de estos 3 países cuando se considere, cualquier persona considere que no está cumpliendo con su deber. Entonces, pues es nada más el hacer esa puntualización y bueno, aquí voy a
Sí,
nada más, perdón.
qué bueno que lo mencionas, porque también es otra cosa que se puede hacer. O sea, al momento de que estén en revisión este tipo de instrumentos legales, ya sean normatividad, o sea, normas o leyes o reglamentos, hay parte del proceso pues es obviamente recabar el interés público, entonces ya sea, o sea, más bien detectar cuáles son esos momentos y cuando lo sean, pues buscar el medio para hacer llegar la preocupación pública de que se consideren los aspectos pues, más relevantes que se tengan, ¿no?
Sí, es un aspecto esencial de la evaluación ambiental estratégica y que también va de la mano con nuestros derechos humanos en materia ambiental, ¿no? Y bueno, aquí quiero expresar, más bien no son preguntas, son manifestaciones de Pablo Alcaraz, que nos dice que el que se sobreponga el objetivo económico por encima de lo ambiental es lo que ha provocado la devastación de la biodiversidad y que la legislación es buena en general, pero la corrupción no permite su estricta aplicación. También nos señala que estrechar vínculos con los integrantes del Poder Legislativo se ha realizado, pero muchos de ellos no toman la decisión por los costos políticos que ello puede conllevar. Entonces, pues es una interesante reflexión de Pablo que quería externarte y a todos
Sí,
nuestros espectadores.
está interesante esa reflexión. O sea, también, digo, otro de los momentos muy claros que podemos utilizar para participar en ese tipo de decisiones, pues son las elecciones, ¿no? O sea, y buscar aquellos candidatos con los cuales nos identifiquemos y representen el interés ambiental y lo representen de una forma que nosotros creamos como conveniente. Entonces, votar por aquellas personas para que a su vez ellos promuevan los cambios que se requieren.
Gracias, y hacer presión también como Greta, ¿no? Es algo que les digo a los alumnos, la verdad que la juventud es la que tiene ahorita todo ese poder de hacer cambiar a las políticas públicas hacia donde esperamos para sobrevivir, ¿no? O vivir más dignamente. Y bueno, por último, esta es una felicitación de Juan Carlos Tejeda, que te pregunta cómo te va en tu doctorado. Bueno,
Gracias, Juan
él
Carlos.
nos hace la pregunta de cómo se establecería esta estrategia, que ya nos hiciste favor de contestar. Y bueno, me dice Pablo Alcázar que está en la Secretaría de Medio Ambiente de Michoacán. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos.
Perfecto. Hola, doctora.
Hola, ¿qué tal, Marco? Pues creo que la profesora Luz Marcela tuvo un problema técnico, ¿no? Pero creo
Sí,
que ya
pensé
había
que era mi
concluido.
computadora.
¿No? Pero creo que ya había concluido
Adelante.
con las preguntas. Sí, entonces
Así es.
pues ya agradecerte mucho, Marco, toda la exposición, de verdad, fue muy enriquecedora. Yo quiero nada más destacar lo que decías, ¿no? De conocer qué está pasando en el mundo para poder nosotros analizar qué nos conviene, ¿no? Porque muchas veces lo que hacemos como abogados es tratar de adoptar sin ninguna otra medida lo que se hace en otros países, pero hay que analizar cómo se hace en otros países para nosotros poder ver que sí se adapta acá, ¿no? Lo que decimos coloquialmente como tropicalizar. Eso es la parte importante. Exacto. Y la otra cuestión muy importante es pues que yo creo que a través de esta plática nuestros alumnos, tanto del CUTONALA como del Tecnológico de Monterrey, pues pudieron ver esta faceta del derecho ambiental, ¿no? Que a veces no es muy promovida, pero es indispensable, ¿no? Entonces, por eso nosotros que tengamos este tipo de pláticas, que los alumnos puedan ver este tipo de campo de trabajo en donde pues es para mejorarlo, donde vivimos, como decía la profesora Luz Marcela, ¿no? Hacer un lugar más digno donde vivir, es algo que nos ayuda mucho, ¿sí? Y en este sentido, pues nada más para cerrar, quiero que, pues aunque sea virtualmente, te podamos dar este pequeño pues reconocimiento por tu plática. Ya te lo haremos llegar en su momento, lo haremos viajar por la mitad del mundo para que tú lo puedas tener, ¿no? Y pues de verdad muchísimas gracias por esta plática. Nos fue muy útil, muy enriquecedora y yo creo que generó mucha expectativa entre el público. Aquí yo estuve viendo el chat, hubo muchísimas personas interesadas, entonces de verdad agradecerte esto.
Un placer. ¿Sí? Muchas gracias a ustedes por la invitación.
No, igualmente.
Muchas gracias.
Y a la doctora Luz Marcela por coordinar esta plática, de verdad. Ella abrió las puertas de su materia para poder tener a un invitado de tan gran relieve y con un importante tema tan actual y trascendental, ¿no? Entonces, pues al público en general también agradecerle mucho que nos acompañó y que estén atentos ahí a nuestras redes porque vamos a tener ahí algunas otras pláticas que pueden ser de su interés, ¿no? Y ya también viene nuestra semana jurídica, que es ahí en noviembre. Pues, sin más preámbulo, pues muchísimas gracias y estamos en contacto. Que estén bien.
Muchas gracias, buenas tardes.
Hasta luego. Gracias. De nada, hasta luego.